Thrilling presentations. Now I would encourage you, I saw you each during the other's presentation reacting with body language, so please put that into words.
Well, I'm still trying to come to grips with the conversation. But I think we had something in common. Number one, we've been working on the same city, on two sides of the same city, around, which of course is eternal, so we have plenty of work ahead of us. And also, what I learned, what I admired from reading Professor Brown's work is the complex texture of individual lives in a variety of historical events. How there are a number of stories going on at the same time, and they're all in dialogue and in conflict with one another. So, in a way, what I've been doing for the present with different documents is not so different. Trying to recreate the complex texture of a culture and of a society at a given moment in time. Okay, now that I got my mouth open. I have a little story here. And the story is, I got invited with other colleagues to a conference in Brazil about oral history then. And we each get one morning. And I do my first presentation. I speak first. And I say, what I love about oral history is that it's an art of the individual. Because memory goes to individual minds, because individuals have different experiences, so on and so forth. Great. My colleague, Mary Marshall Clark, who heads the oral history office at the Columbia University, comes in the next day. She hasn't heard me. And so she starts out and she says, what is wonderful about oral history is that it's an art of the collective. She gets a big laugh. She doesn't know why. So then we talked about it. And we decided that, of course, I say it's an art of the individual. I come from a culture, this was the 90s, where the dominant trends were Catholic solidarity and socialist Marxist solidarity, the masses, humanity, and recognizing that the masses are made of individuals goes against the grain of what was in our dominant culture. Very much of Clark's come from a culture where there's no such thing as society that's of individuals. And so talking about the collective means going against the grain. So what we were both doing were going against the grain of the established narratives of our culture. I don't know if I intended this story, but there must have been some reason. Thank you.
My first reaction, of course, is I wish I could jump on a time machine and do for my people what Alessandro showed so wonderfully can be done in modern times. That raises two problems, I think. One is historians always write under the influence of other approaches. It's one of the great mysteries that one writes better history of, say, the distant past, of, say, the fall of Rome, if you spend times wishing, oh, I wish I could write this as if I were Alessandro, Bernard Brodel, or some other historical master, not in our period. It's a bit like just recently I watched the wind circles of the lighthouse on the beach. And the miracle, of course, is they set their sails in ways that you think that they would blow over, and they go, and that's what historians are like. They set their sails often through winds very different from those generated necessarily in their own subject, and wisdom. That's one thing. On a deeper level, I really do think, and I think this is something which Alessandro was very frank about, and which I think all historians have to be frank, is the sheer vertigo of the past. That there is a real chasm between us and other people in our own world as in the distant world. And in a sense, we use a language of chronological distance. We use a before the Christian era, after the Christian era, dating to give a sense of distance, but it's only a concretization of the deeper sense. That human beings are irreducibly different from each other. Their sciences have to be respected. And that sort of thrill of what one might call positive agoraphobia, of not trespassing prematurely on an individual in the present or on a period in the past. And I think there one should always encourage salutary vertigo.
Yes. The first question.
Thank you, both of our speakers, for the privilege of listening to you. I have a question to Professor Portelli, but it resonated with something which Professor Brown said about the notion of silence. I was deeply impressed by what Professor Portelli said about my interpretation of avoiding condescension in terms of the oral study, whom you were addressing, the language which is used. And yet, there is also an audience that you're writing to, and therefore, if you insist on being silent, by leaving out the wider context, or part of the wider context in which this is occurred. I happen to be involved in using at least the tools of oral history in terms of the growth of scientific knowledge, and therefore interviewing scientists, outstanding scientists, and therefore, if I were, I need a language, which means I need a certain technical know-how in order to get through to you. If I were to get silence, then I wouldn't be able to get what I want to know. And therefore, this huge respect that both of you have for notions of silence, it bothers me in terms of how does one become a little bit more of a historian to try to present a somewhat more objective view of what has happened.
Thank you. I will ask each to respond to the question. With it.
I have this image in mind, which may not be correct, that the ratio of what is spoken to what is unspoken is about the same as the ratio to, is about the same as the ratio of land to oceans on the planet. And speech is very often not much more than an island in an ocean of silence. And on the one hand, part of the work of the explorer is to enable language to emerge. But you don't get that if you don't go in very, very carefully and respectfully. And there's a story by Rebecca Harding Davis. She's a writer, mid 19th century, and she writes a story. It's a story about, it's an early story about factory workers, 1860. And at one point she says, "All I can give you is the outlines of a night," which means that we can only get to the boundaries of what is unspeakable. And then in there, ipsos leonis, and there are wild animals, there's darkness. So, and perhaps the only way that we manage to allow those silences to be broken, the stories to emerge, is by being there, being willing, and not interfere. And the fact that we respect the silence often encourages people to talk. Sometimes you get much more information from the silence than you get from words, because there are things that it would take great poets to put them into words. And we're not all great poets. So sometimes we might be getting cliches, repetitions of formulas, whereas the silence is so much and so much deeper. So I think, although the only way of expanding the world of narrative, the realm of narrative, so expanding the territories of language is by respecting silence. And maybe if we're lucky, this will encourage people to talk.
Professor Bell.
As an ancient historian, of course, here I think the rules which Professor Portelli abides by, which are deeply sensitive, based on a modern psychological sensitivity. These are rules I would love to impose on myself where I confronted by a late Roman person. I, of course, am defeated by silence. There are too many silences. And there I tell you, one of the reasons, particularly for late antiquity, again, is not distance in time or destruction of the evidence. There's always more evidence than you think. There are the hopeless optimists. I can usually give examples. But what I think you have to realize in many ancient societies, particularly ancient societies where religious issues come to be dominant, if not in daily life, but in the actual textual production of society. Texts are dangerous because they're there to close dialogue. They always write a lie. There is always a lie around the late antique text, which says we've got our world into order. There is therefore always, in at least the formal text that we read every day on the shelves of libraries, we say, I don't trust you. We say, we don't trust you because the inner mechanism by which textuality is a mechanism of creating order out of disorder and above all bringing about closure. One need only think of the silence of the Talmud on Christianity, led by the absurd stereotypes of supersessionist Christianity against Judaism. This is not simply a regrettable, controversial encounter. It is the logic of texts that want to keep their word tidy. So our main job is to always go for the margins. People say you read between the lines. These are very clever texts. The lines are very tight. Always something in the margin. Some little hesitation. Somebody says, or there are foolish people who say, and then you read it. You've got it. The weave is unraveling. It's like a sweater. And you pull hard enough, you have to hold the sweater open. That's a very different sort of silence. And that's the silence we are constantly. In terms of long-term optimism, there's an enormous amount of this. The Syriaca.org just shows, it's just one example of how much late Roman material there actually is that people basically have summoned up the energy to read. They have discovered that in my own lifetime, I studied Augustine because I was lazy. You realize. I was trained as a medicalist, and I made the decision when I was doing very virtuous research on a late 15th century bishop that I had discovered indeed one real, absolutely incontrovertible fact. And then I calculated that I had traveled at least 150 miles to establish this one fact. I'd spent 2 days establishing this one fact. I had sat in the Bodleian library and read the Patrologia over 2 days. I might have got through 2 volumes, who knows? So I had opted for a world where I could hope to be virtually textual version. Script permanent, what you see is what you're going to get, your business is, as you expanded on this island, to make sense of what that is. What happens? I arrived in Berkeley in the late 70s. Somebody tells me they've discovered 29 totally new letters of Augustine. I went to the library, they had miscalculated, they had miscatalogued it, which I finally got it. I took it out to a Xerox, Pico Xerox, and these days, don't forget, I must be truly a historicist of these matters. This is a 1979 Xerox. Suddenly, as I looked, I saw here was a letter about the misdeeds of an application, of which I had one version from the old known letters of Augustine. Here I was having a totally new story. I never thought that would happen. one's philology, a challenge to one's knowledge of African place names, a challenge for a new view of Augustine in his more concrete, secular bishop's jurisdiction background, because these letters were copied because they were not copied all later because they were too interesting. They dealt with small court cases, they dealt with real life of North Africa. Those are the joys of actually do that. So all of you never let yourself get bored. There's always something may turn up. And never adopt methodologies or stances that weaken your ability to interpret new material. That's important. Something awful will happen. That is, an important document in a language you don't know appears, and you not learn. And if you run down those skills, you won't. So, be on your guard.
First, thanks to Aviv for bringing us two masters. I've got two brief comments. One, Alessandro Portelli reminded me of an elderly colleague at this university who went to, in the 50s, went to Oxford to write his thesis on the war in this region in 1948 and 1949. He never finished. And I once asked him later, why not? Well, he said, my work was based on personal interviews of officers in general, and I went to Oxford to write the book, and when I was halfway through writing, I thought I needed some more information. I went back, and all my customers contradicted themselves. And then I gave up. So now I've learned that he gave up where he should have started. Then you mentioned Rome being eternal, of course. That again reminds me of the conversation we had the day before yesterday, Peter Brown and I, about optimism and pessimism. And we've heard about optimism here. Rome is eternal, but many of us have read Polybius, where he tells Scipio weeping when he causes the destruction of Carthage, weeping because what happens to Carthage will one day happen to Rome. So that's pessimism. Now, I, at the time, went through the same sort of gymnasium Peter Brown went to, where antiquity is 5th and 4th century BC and 1st century BC, and then you've got decline. Tacitus is no longer the same as Cicero. So for Cicero, of course, Rome was eternal. For Polybius, it wasn't. So I wonder whether the view of antiquity as basically a golden age that lasts twice a century or two is dictated by pessimistic historians, and we might learn something different from opportunistic but optimistic politicians.
I entirely agree with Isaac. The Romans always believed in their own decline and fall. I think it's one of the real difficulties we actually experience to actually get what each people really thought about the immediate future. This is one of the great unknowns. As I said yesterday to Professor Isaac, if I had a time machine and was going to interview the Emperor Constantine, I would not waste my time asking whether he was a Christian or not. He told me great thing that he was, and there was nothing that I would not have learned from him that I did not have learned from my colleague, Professor. Regards or other hundreds of Constantine, I would have asked him, how does he think what will happen in the next 50 years? And that would be a real question. I think you're absolutely right. Traditional societies tend to have dramatic images of their own time, and also dramatic images of their own decline, so that somebody can put them to rights. They're rather like old-fashioned collectible cards that constantly break down, but you're also constantly convinced that they roll out of the garage again with, a bit souped up with a few headlights restored, because the old car doesn't die, really. It suffers from renovatio. And the Romans also loved renovatio. And when things were going on really tough, the renovatio coins flourished. The last issue of the late 7th century are actually discovered in villages which by that time are on the wrong side of the Muslim-Byzantine frontier, still renovatio imperii going strong. So there's both the heady pessimism and the heady belief that the kaleidoscope will come together again. It's a kaleidoscopic view in some ways. It's one which historians love tracing how it actually affects people's actions and attitudes, whether, for instance, we can talk of moods of growing despair, for instance, in a given late Roman society. I'm not at all sure. I think they are immunized against disaster through having thought of it in dramatic terms from childhood upwards. A bit like, say, Austrians in 1918, the situation is always catastrophic but not serious.
And, well, I'm reminded of a cliche from Antonio Gramsci, who talks about the pessimism of intelligence and the optimism of the will. And I think it's a pretty good guide to action. Things will probably go as bad as they can, but we will turn them around. The other thing that makes me optimistic about all this is, number one, that, and this applies to all kinds of intellectual endeavor, I think, but in the case of oral history, it's very visible. It's never finished. So much. When I was doing this project on the Aviad massacre, 1944, where I was looking both for what happened, but also what people thought that happened. I found myself in a position where every person walking down the street was a source. And Because if they knew what happened when they had information, if they had fantastic myths and narratives, then that was even more interesting. And how do you ever interview all the available? Like 3.5 million people living in the world. Plus, even if you could, they had to start over again because the first ones that were older than they came. So it's never finished. And one thing that oral history does is contemporary history is never finished. Because, of course, you don't have push, because you always have more stories. The other thing is, one of the things that makes me optimistic is that the sources contradict themselves. This great science fiction novel, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, the authorities, the state, are bent on burning books because books don't agree with one another. Because the fact that there are a multiplicity of plurality of narratives. Mark Twain once said, it's the difference of opinions that makes horse races interesting. So, I mean, this is what makes everything interesting. And the destruction of books in the Fahrenheit 451 is exactly the fear that power has of the fact that it doesn't control it. That you cannot impose a single identity on a society. You cannot impose a single narrative. There will always be disagreement. And basically, what I think much of my work has been about is in not solving the contradiction, finding the answers, but identifying the questions. Where is it that people disagree? And therefore why? And then why? And this never ends because you probably interviewed 200 people and you've covered the possibilities, but then just around the corner there may be this the soul of this young man that has a fantastic story to tell, and you're not aware because you're dealing with you're dealing with individuals. So it's never finished, it's never over. And I finished my book on Portelli in 1985. Since I had to write another book 25 years later, and I already know that in the past 10 years, there's material for another book. Because if you're thinking of oral history as a relationship between the present and the past, number one, you need to bring it up to the present. You can't finish your story in 1952. It has to end in this other. And it's like, the first page is in Tristan Shandy, where he says, he tells the story of his birth, and he says, well, it's taken me longer to tell the story of my birth than it took me to be born. If I go at this pace, I will never catch up with facts. The facts will always be faster than my narrative. So this is part of the fascination. The unfinishedness. And of course, this also applies to ancient history. There's always another document around the corner, or there's always another reading of a document you've already read around the corner. So this is what makes it interesting. This is fun.
Thank you very much. It is now my sad duty to bring this symposium to a close. It's been a privilege to be in the presence of two great historians who reflected from their vast scholarly experience on more or less the same things: memory, forgetting texts, words, borders, confined borders, and infinity, borderlessness. and pessimism and optimism. Thank you, thank you, thank you.